Please be seated. It's wonderful to be here. Well, there are such rich readings in today's service that it was hard to pick, but I'm going to focus with you for a few minutes on the gospel reading. I am the vine, you are the branches. Partly because the Dean's Forum today will be focused on metaphor and the power of metaphor and the dangers of metaphor, so I hope to see some of you there. In the Gospel of John, Jesus makes 4 metaphorical statements about himself. I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. I am the good shepherd. And I am the true vine. You are the branches. We know he loved metaphor. The parables are rooted in metaphorical thinking. The scriptures Jesus knew intimately, the Torah, the Psalms, the prophets, the wisdom books, all of them are rich with metaphor. God is a fountain of mercy. God is a rock and a fortress, a shield, a dwelling place, a bridegroom, a builder, a lamb. Everything in the world God created, animal, vegetable, mineral, speaks of God. The trees of the field clap their hands. The hills break forth in singing. The sea covers the earth like a garment. Artists and poets and even scientists have drawn on and amplified this way of seeing the world through metaphor. I love especially Kazensaki's line, which some of you may know. That's not from the Bible, obviously, but in keeping with the way it points us to the natural world for understanding. I said to the almond tree, "Speak to me of God," and the tree blossomed. And I love Mary Oliver's witness to the work of vultures who minister to the grassy miles. She starts that poem by likening vultures to butterflies. That bears some thinking. It's worth asking then why so much of divine teaching and revelation come to us through metaphor. How is it that the disciples, fairly literal-minded fishermen, so often had to ask Jesus to make his meaning plain? He could have spoken more simply to them, perhaps, but instead he was training them to think poetically, because there are dimensions of truth that are only available through poetry. This is an English teacher speaking. I believe this. Metaphor is not just a decorative poetic device. It's a habit of mind. It's an invitation to reach out just beyond what we can rationally understand into the mystery of what we can't. It's a reminder that some of the deepest things can't be known by reason alone, but have to be approached with imagination. Some of you may be familiar with the Ignatian exercises and with Ignatian spirituality and how deeply St. Ignatius believed in the importance, and I might even say the centrality of imagination in spiritual life. To love God with our whole mind is to allow our imaginations to be awakened, to let our minds play and be played upon like light on water. The literary theorist Paul Ricoeur has written that metaphors have what he calls a surplus of meaning. They don't just say one thing that can be translated back into plain propositional statement. They offer an overflow of additional suggestions and nuances and possibilities of meaning. A rich metaphor can startle us into reframing what we thought we knew. It can awaken or heighten our awareness of how all things are related. It can teach us, for instance, that the rainforests are the lungs of the earth, and the rivers are its veins, and that the trees are Earth's guardians. Those give us ways of thinking about the world that's ours to steward. So when Jesus says to the disciples, "I am the true vine," he's teaching them about the nature of their relationship to him and of his to God, the Creator. That relationship is organic and dynamic, as ordinary and as complex as the relationship of branch to vine, to root, to soil and sun, and of the plant to the gardener. He is the true vine. The emphasis on true not only distinguishes Jesus from false prophets, but insists on the importance of the figure itself. This image tells a truth like no other. See who I am in just this way. It's a moment of tender, surprising, sometimes edgy, poetic self-revelation. Even for the bemused men who sat with him around that table, the figure of the vine and the branches would have been familiar. Their neighbors worked in vineyards, and they knew the Torah and the Psalms, where the vines and branches appear often as images of fruitfulness or abundance or vulnerability or promise. Jacob describes his son Joseph as a fruitful bough by a spring. His branches run over a wall. Later, the psalmist, reminding God of his mercy, writes, "You brought a vine out of Egypt. It took deep root and filled the land. It sent out its branches to the sea and its shoots to the river." Vines and other plants do a lot of branching in the Hebrew Bible. So when Jesus says to those he taught and loved, "You are the branches," they know something about what branches do. I had to look it up. They receive and distribute the sap that comes to them through the vine. They bud and bear fruit. They make leaves to protect the grapes out of soil nutrients and sun and morning dew. They reach and climb. They grow in different directions. They need pruning. Branches have a rich, intricate relationship to the vine. At the direction of plant hormones, and there are 5 important plant hormones, and they all have names, the internal messengers, their cells divide. They change and grow and adapt, each in its own branching way. They produce leaves that shade the young fruit. They depend utterly on the vine, which depends utterly on the vine dresser. Vines are plants that need tending. When they grow wild, the fruit isn't very good. One botanist writes that the puzzle of shape, diversity, and adaptability turns out to be tied to the fundamentals of being a plant. Grappling with gravity, fighting for sunlight, all while anchored in one place for a lifetime. Those branches have things to do. One of the most amusing and instructive moments I remember with one of our small grandsons, when he was about 2, occurred on a walk when he stopped me by a cedar tree he loved. This little guy was a tree hugger. Nobody taught him to do that. He would just hang out with a tree here and there. He asked, "Amma, what is the tree doing?" So I gave him a little mini lecture on oxygen and carbon dioxide. But I found myself moved in that moment by the insightfulness of his question. Trees and shrubs and vines are doing something. They're doing their work. They are living beings. Little Benjamin knew that. Life is happening in the vine and the branches, and Jesus links that life to the source of all life, lest we forget the deep dependence and interdependence that links all creation to the Creator who tends us as the gardener tends the vine. And I want to emphasize here that these are life forms because we live in a culture that commodifies everything in sight and makes verbs into nouns and nouns into marketable things. Notice how Jesus doesn't identify himself as the vine dresser, the one who prunes and tends, but rather as the one who, having entered into the created order, has been planted and tended and has extended his own life into the life of the branch. Leslie Newbigin, exploring this passage, reminds us that the production of fruit is not directly the responsibility of the branches. This is good news for us. The gardener charges himself with the responsibility. There are branches that bear fruit, but these have to be pruned in order to be more fruitful still. So it's the gardener who has to attend to the fruitfulness. Pruning is kind of an unsettling part of this metaphor. The pruning and the lopping off and the throwing into the fire. There's a lot to say about that. I'm not going to go there except to say that what is not fruitful in us, in each of us, will be pruned away. And we can trust that. Branches will be removed for the sake of the greater good. Promising tendrils will be cut off. Vine dressers tend vines with what they call a training system. Vines that bear good fruit aren't wild, but they're carefully, watchfully, tenderly, knowledgeably cultivated. But Newbigin points out there is deep theological comfort in this figure as well. The disciple doesn't have to be anxious about bearing fruit. We don't have to hasten out and be busy about many things in order to be fruitful. The disciple has only one task: to abide in the vine. Stay with me, abide in me. Receive. The rest is the work of the gardener. And so this abiding means staying in a relationship of love and obedience. And the root word of obedience, I love this bit of etymology, is to listen, to hear. The disciples' work is to receive the Spirit and allow themselves to be nourished and tended and cared for, to be held and watched and loved. It's their work to allow themselves to be cultivated and shaped to the work that's given them to do. Every day, in 1,000 ways, if we open ourselves to guidance, the cultivating influence of the Spirit who dwells within us and among us, we are being pruned and nourished and watched and tended. We are being trained and prepared. And as I have liked telling my students over the years, you never know what you are being prepared for. None of us does. But we are being prepared. We're being shaped, as the poet Dylan Thomas put it, by the force that through the green fuse drives the flower. The force that through the vine shapes the branches. And the best of what we bring forth will come from a source both within and beyond ourselves that we don't get to either measure or control. All our work, our growing and branching and bearing, begins simply in receiving the gift of life, graciously given and graciously maintained. Thanks be to God.